In the glittering ballrooms of 1818, London, a woman's reputation was as fragile as spun glass. For Miss Elara Vance, a single night was meant to be her chance at a future. Instead, it became her trial by fire. Before the unpitying eyes of the entire aristocracy, she was made a spectacle, her dreams turned to dust, her spirit crushed under the weight of cruel, echoing laughter. She stood alone, drowning in shame. But then, through the jeering crowd, a man moved. Not just any man, but the one man whose attention could either seal her ruin or forge her salvation. What happened next was not just a kiss. It was an act of war. The air in Devonshire House was thick enough to be sliced with a duchess's fan, a heady concoction of beeswax French perfume, and the sweet, cloying scent of hothouse roses wilting under the heat of 1,000 candles. For Miss Elara Vance, it was the smell of suffocation. She stood near a marble column, the cool stone, a small comfort against the bare skin of her back, her fingers nervously pleating the modest silk of her pale blue gown. It was a hand-me-down, skillfully altered by her own hands, but in a sea of opulent satins and intricate Belgian lace, she felt like a common sparrow that had mistakenly flown into an aviary of peacocks. This London season was her mother's last desperate gamble. Since her father's death, 2 years prior, their genteel country life had evaporated, leaving behind a mountain of quiet debts and the crushing reality that their name, Vance, was no longer enough. Elara at 20 possessed a mind too sharp and a talent too unconventional for the marriage market. Her true passion lay not in mastering the pianoforte or perfecting her curtsy, but in the forbidden, messy world of charcoal sticks and watercolor pigments. Her small private sketchbooks were filled with the raw, honest faces of their tenants, the gnarled bark of ancient oaks, the truth of the world as she saw it, a truth that had no place in a ballroom. "Stand up straighter, Elara," her mother, Mrs. Vance, hissed from behind her fan. Her face was a mask of strained optimism. "You must look approachable, not like a frightened mouse. Lord Ashworth is looking this way." Elara's gaze flickered towards the portly, red-faced baron her mother indicated. He was old enough to be her grandfather with a wet cough and eyes that seemed to appraise her as one would a brood mare. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. This was the transaction, stripped of all its silken trappings, her youth and compliance, in exchange for security. Her eyes scanned the room, a desperate search for a reprieve, and landed on the room's glittering, venomous centre, Lady Beatrice Finch. The daughter of a wealthy marquess, Beatrice was the diamond of the season, impossibly beautiful, flawlessly dressed, and possessed of a cruelty as sharp and polished as the gems around her neck. She held court near the orchestra, her laughter a high, musical sound that always seemed to be at someone else's expense, and tonight her target was clear. Beatrice's eyes, the colour of a winter sky, met Elara's across the crowded floor. A slow, malicious smile spread across her perfect lips. Elara had done nothing to earn her ire, save for perhaps existing. Or perhaps it was the brief, scholarly conversation she'd had with a young viscount about Italian art last week, a conversation Beatrice had swiftly and decisively ended by spilling a glass of punch down the front of the viscount's waistcoat. "Ah, Miss Vance," a voice purred beside her. It was Beatrice having crossed the room with the silent grace of a hunting cat. Her friends, a trio of simpering ladies, trailed in her wake. One rarely sees you so far from the wall. "Are you enjoying the festivities?" Lady Beatrice Elara managed her voice tighter than she'd intended. The Duchess is a most generous hostess. Beatrice's eyes raked over Elara's simple gown. Indeed, her generosity extends to all corners of society, it seems. The insult was subtle, a dagger wrapped in velvet, and her friends tittered appreciatively. My father mentioned he passed your former estate in Hampshire last month. He said the gardens have grown quite wild. The barb struck home. Ilara's father had poured his soul into those gardens. Her cheeks burned with a shame that was hot and fierce. Nature has its own artistry, my lady. Artistry. Beatrice's laugh was brittle. Is that what you call it? I have heard whispers of your hobby, Miss Vance. Doodling, is it? How quaint. A suitable pastime for a young woman with a great deal of time on her hands, I suppose. Before Ilara could form a reply, Beatrice's gaze sharpened, zeroing in on the small reticule clutched in Ilara's hand. It was a simple drawstring bag, but tonight it held her most treasured and dangerous possession, her small, leather-bound sketchbook. She had brought it on a whim, hoping to capture the curve of a crystal chandelier or the fall of a lady's shawl in a quiet moment. It was a foolish, reckless impulse. What have you there? Beatrice asked, her voice dangerously sweet. A list of potential suitors, perhaps. Let us see if you've included poor Lord Ashworth. With a movement so swift Ilara couldn't react, Beatrice snatched the reticule. Her friends giggled as Beatrice's long, pale fingers pulled the bag open and retrieved the sketchbook. No, not a list, Beatrice announced, her voice rising to carry across the suddenly quieting room. The orchestra seemed to falter. Heads began to turn. Something far more interesting. It seems Miss Vance is not merely a wallflower, but an artist in our midst. She opened the book. Ilara's heart stopped. A wave of cold terror washed over her. The book wasn't just landscapes. It contained her private studies, her attempts to capture true emotion. And on the first page Beatrice opened was the most recent unfinished sketch, a raw charcoal portrait of a man she had seen only from a distance, a man whose presence had intrigued her for weeks. He had a harsh, beautiful face, haunted eyes, and a stillness that set him apart from the preening peacocks of the ton. It was a face that spoke of storms and sorrows, and she had tried to capture it. The man was Alistair Beaumont, the Earl of Blackwood, the reclusive, formidable war hero they called the Demon of Waterloo. Beatrice held the book aloft. My. And who is this brooding specimen? Such intensity, such passion, she mocked, her voice dripping with insinuation. She turned the page. And look, the face of old Mrs. Higgins from the market wrinkles and all. How utterly vulgar. A ripple of cruel laughter started soft at first, then swelling as more and more people turned to stare. They saw the country girl, the poor relation, not only presuming to practice a man's craft, but daring to sketch the formidable Earl of Blackwood with such unnerving intimacy. It was an act of profound social arrogance, an unforgivable breach of decorum. She carries charcoal smudges in her bag. Instead of scented powders, one of Beatrice's friends cried out, and the laughter grew louder, more pointed. Ilara stood frozen, pinned by 100 pairs of eyes. Her mother looked as if she might faint. The air, once merely suffocating, was now crushing the very breath from her lungs. Every gilded mirror seemed to reflect her own mortified face, her shame multiplied infinitely. The sound of their laughter was a physical blow, a storm of ridicule that threatened to tear her apart. This was not just embarrassment. This was ruin. The world had narrowed to a single tormenting sound, the chorus of high society laughter. It was a beast with 100 mouths, each one tearing a piece from Ilara's dignity. Her vision blurred the candle flames, merging into streaks of merciless gold. She could feel the heat on her face, a flush of humiliation so profound it felt like a fever. Lady Beatrice held the sketchbook like a trophy, her smile a triumphant slash of red in her pale, perfect face. Perhaps she hopes to sell her little drawings, Beatrice projected her voice, carrying over the din. A new way for the fallen gentry to make their way in the world. What do you suppose a portrait of an earl would fetch, gentlemen? The question hung in the air, dripping with poison. It reduced Elara from a lady to a tradeswoman, from an artist to a grasping, desperate merchant in the most public forum imaginable. Someone in the crowd snickered a low, ugly sound. Elara's mother let out a small, strangled gasp and took a step back, subtly disassociating herself from the source of the scandal. In that moment, Elara had never felt more utterly alone. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She wanted to vanish, to rewind time, to have never picked up a charcoal stick in her life. Her dreams, her private passions had been ripped from the quiet sanctuary of her mind and flayed open for the amusement of these cruel, shallow people. The laughter was a physical force, pressing down on her, and her knees felt weak. And then a sudden jarring silence. It did not fall all at once, but rather cascaded through the ballroom, like a wave starting from the grand archway entrance. The laughter died in people's throats, replaced by murmurs of shock and disbelief. The sea of elegant lords and ladies parted, creating a path. Down that path walked Alistair Beaumont, the Earl of Blackwood. He was the man from her sketchbook brought to startling life. Taller than she'd realized, his presence was a stark slash of black and white against the room's vibrant colors. His evening attire was impeccably tailored, yet he wore it like armor, not adornment. The face she had tried to capture was even more compelling in person, all sharp angles and controlled force, with a scar thin and silver that cut through one dark eyebrow. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, and they were fixed with a terrifying intensity, not on Beatrice but on Elara. He moved with an unnerving economy of motion, each step silent and deliberate. The whispers followed him like his shadow. He had been at the periphery of the room, speaking with the Duke of Wellington himself, when Beatrice's voice had risen. Now the hero of the Peninsular War was advancing on the scene of a ballroom skirmish, and the entire assembly held its breath. He stopped directly in front of the tableau of cruelty. His gaze flickered once to the sketchbook in Beatrice's hand, a flicker of something unreadable, recognition, annoyance, and then returned to Elara's pale, stricken face. He saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the tremble in her lower lip. She was desperately trying to control. Beatrice, momentarily flustered by his sudden appearance, quickly regained her composure. "My Lord Blackwood," she cooed, offering him a dazzling smile. "We were just admiring the work of this budding artist. It seems you are her muse." She held the book out to him, expecting him to join in the mockery. The Earl ignored her outstretched hand. He ignored the book. His focus remained solely on Elara, a gaze so direct and unwavering it felt as though he were the only other person in the universe. The silence in the room was now absolute, thick with anticipation. "Are you all right, Miss Vance?" he asked. His voice was low, a gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate in the charged air. It was not a question of polite concern. It was a demand for the truth. Elara could only manage a slight, jerky nod, unable to trust her own voice. Alistair's jaw tightened. He finally turned his head just enough to pin Lady Beatrice, with a look of such glacial contempt that the colour drained from her cheeks. The triumphant smile froze on her face. "Give it to me," he commanded. It was not a request. Beatrice's hand trembled slightly. For a moment it seemed she might refuse, but under the force of his will her defiance crumbled. She surrendered the sketchbook. Alistair took it without looking at the pages. He tucked it safely inside his coat, an act of quiet possession. Then he did something that sent a collective gasp through the ballroom. He stepped closer to Ilara, closing the small gap between them. He gently took her gloved hand, his touch surprisingly warm and firm. And then he leaned in. For a heart-stopping second, Ilara thought he was going to whisper something to her, to offer a word of comfort. But he did not stop. He tilted his head, and in front of the Duke, the Duchess, the patronesses of Almack's, and the entire gossiping, venomous heart of London society, he pressed his lips to hers. It was not a chaste, polite peck. It was a kiss of breathtaking, deliberate intent. It was firm, warm, and utterly shocking. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment the world shifted on its axis. It was an act of supreme public defiance, a claim, a shield. He pulled back slowly, his storm-grey eyes never leaving hers. The room was so quiet one could have heard a pearl drop onto the parquet floor. He had not just silenced the laughter, he had annihilated it. Still holding her hand, he turned to face the stunned assembly. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and clear, cutting through the silence like a saber. "Miss Vance has honored me with her artistic interpretation." He stated his gaze, sweeping across the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "I find her talent to be as rare and commendable as her character. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." He then looked at the ashen-faced Lady Beatrice, a final dismissive glance. "Your cruelty is as common as your beauty, Lady Beatrice. I find myself unimpressed by both." Without another word, he tucked Ilara's hand securely in the crook of his arm, turned his back on the entire spectacle, and began to lead her from the ballroom floor. He walked not with the haste of escape, but with the proud, unhurried stride of a conqueror. And as they passed through the stunned, silent crowd, Ilara Vance, the poor relation, the object of cruel laughter, felt the warmth of his arm through her glove. The shame that had been burning her alive was extinguished, replaced by a dizzying, terrifying, and glorious new sensation. The Earl's kiss had not just saved her. It had set her on fire. The journey from Devonshire House was a blur of fragmented images for Ilara. The shocked faces of the guests turning to stone, the way the crowd parted for them, as if the Earl of Blackwood were Moses, and they the Red Sea. The cold night air hitting her face as they emerged onto the torch-lit street, a shock after the stifling heat of the ballroom. Her mother, for once, was speechless, scurrying behind them like a bewildered hen. Lord Blackwood did not release her arm until he had handed her and her mother into their hired carriage. He spoke a curt word to the driver, gave a final unreadable look at Ilara, and then melted back into the London night, leaving a maelstrom of silence in his wake. The carriage ride back to their modest rented rooms in Bloomsbury was excruciating. The air crackled with unspoken words. Mrs. Vance kept opening and closing her mouth, her fan fluttering like a trapped bird against her chest. Ilara stared out at the passing gaslights, her own reflection a ghostly stranger in the glass. Her lips still tingled from the pressure of his. It was a phantom sensation, a brand of heat that seemed to seep into her very soul. Once they were inside their cramped parlour, the dam of her mother's shock finally broke. "Ilara, what have you done?" she cried, sinking onto a threadbare settee. To be the centre of such a spectacle, Lady Beatrice, the sketchbook, and then the Earl, an unmarried man, kissing you in public. "We are ruined, utterly and completely ruined. I did nothing, Mother." Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. The initial shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a strange, cold clarity. "Lady Beatrice stole my private property and sought to humiliate me. The Earl simply stopped her. Stopped her. He has made you the talk of the entire city. Do you not understand tomorrow every gossip columnist, every drawing-room harpy from Mayfair to Cheapside will be discussing this? They will not see a rescue. They will see an assignation. They will assume the worst, that you are his mistress, that there is an understanding, a scandalous understanding. And what would be so terrible about that? Elara countered a spark of defiance she didn't know she possessed, flaring to life. To be linked with a man who showed kindness and courage rather than one who joined in the laughter. Kindness that was not kindness, you foolish girl, that was possession. The Earl of Blackwood is not a safe man. They say he is ruthless cold, that the war hollowed him out. He has shown no interest in any debutante for 2 seasons. Why you, a penniless girl with ink on her fingers? It makes no sense. He has used you, Elara, for some purpose of his own, and we will be the ones to pay the price. Her mother's words were meant to frighten her, but they only solidified a strange resolve taking root in her heart. Alistair Beaumont had not felt like a user. He had felt like a shield. His eyes had not held contempt, but a flicker of something she dared not name. Understanding perhaps sleep was impossible that night. Elara lay in her bed, tracing the Earl's face in her mind's eye, replaying the kiss over and over. It had not been romantic in the poetic sense. It was too fierce, too public for that. It was a statement, a political act in the theatre of the ballroom. He had drawn a line in the sand and placed her firmly on his side of it. The question, as her mother had so rightly pointed out, was why. The answer arrived the next afternoon. A footman in a severe black and silver livery, the Blackwood colours, delivered a note addressed to her. Her mother snatched it first, her hands trembling as she broke the wax seal. He requests an audience. She breathed her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He wishes to call upon you. This afternoon. Alone. Alone. The word sent a shiver down Elara's spine. It was a shocking breach of propriety. This is it, her mother whispered, a frantic, calculating gleam in her eyes. The fear of ruin was rapidly being replaced by the dizzying possibility of a different outcome. This is a proposal. It must be no man of his standing would compromise a lady so thoroughly without offering marriage. Elara, this is our salvation. Elara felt a knot of apprehension. Marriage. To a man she did not know, a man spoken of in whispers and shadows, yet the alternative facing society alone, after last night, was unthinkable. At precisely 3 o'clock, the Earl of Blackwood was shown into their small parlour. He filled the room his height, and the breadth of his shoulders seeming to shrink the already modest space. He was dressed not in formal evening wear, but in the impeccable severe attire of a gentleman, a dark blue coat, buff trousers, and polished Hessian boots. He held her sketchbook in one hand. He bowed curtly to her mother, who was fluttering with an excess of nervous energy, and then his gaze settled on Elara. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice as low and steady as it had been in the ballroom, "I would be grateful for a private word with your daughter." It was a request phrased as a command. Mrs. Vance, torn between propriety and the sheer force of his will, stammered her assent and practically fled to the room, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Miss Vance, he began walking towards the window and looking out at the drab street. "I trust you are recovered from last night's events." "I am well, my lord, and I am in your debt." "You did not have to intervene." "Yes, I did," he said, turning to face her. His expression was serious, unsmiling. "I have seen enough bullies in my life, on and off the battlefield, to recognize them. I will not stand by and watch their sport." He gestured with the sketchbook. "Lady Beatrice was wrong. This is not vulgar." He opened the book not to his own portrait, but to the sketch of Mrs. Higgins, the market woman. He studied it for a long moment. "You saw her?" he said, almost to himself. "You didn't just draw her wrinkles. You captured her exhaustion, but also her resilience. You see the truth in people. That is not a hobby. It is a rare, and to some, a dangerous talent." Ilara was stunned. No one had ever spoken of her art that way. They saw it as a messy, unfeminine pastime. He saw its power. "Why did you do it, my lord?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The kiss. It has set every tongue in London wagging." "That was the intention," he replied coolly. "Laughter is a mob. A mob can only be dispersed by a greater force. Last night I made it clear that you are under my protection. The gossips can chatter all they wish, but no one will dare to openly mock you again. They fear me more than they enjoy their own cruelty." His honesty was as bracing as a winter wind. There were no pretty words, no false sentiment. It was a strategic assessment. "But in protecting me, you have irrevocably tied my name to yours," she pointed out, her chin lifting. "My mother believes you are here to offer marriage." A flicker of something, regret, frustration, crossed his face. He walked back towards her, stopping a few feet away. "Miss Vance, my actions last night were impulsive, but not without consequence for both of us. A proposal of marriage, however, is complicated." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are obligations tied to my name, my estate, that I cannot easily ignore. Debts not of my own making, but which fall to me to resolve." The unspoken words hung between them. "I am required to marry a fortune." Ilara's brief, insane flicker of hope died. Of course, it was always about money. He was no different. Yet his next words surprised her. However, he continued, his grey eyes intense. "I cannot leave you to face the fallout of my actions alone. The scandal I created must be managed. Your reputation is now my responsibility. Therefore, I have a different proposal for you. Not of marriage, but of a temporary and very public arrangement." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. A different proposal. The air in the small parlour seemed to thin, charged with the weight of his words. An arrangement she echoed, the word tasting foreign and slightly scandalous on her tongue. A courtship, Alistair clarified his expression, unyielding. A public and seemingly devoted courtship. We will be seen together. We will attend the opera ride in the park and appear at the necessary social functions. I will send you flowers. I will call on you regularly. To all the world we will appear to be on the inevitable path to marriage." Ilara's heart gave a painful thud. A performance. He was proposing they stage a play for the benefit of the ton. And to what end, my lord? A courtship that leads nowhere will only create a different, more prolonged scandal. It will not lead nowhere, he countered, his voice low and persuasive. It will lead to a quiet, mutual dissolution at the end of the season. We will let it be known that we have discovered we are not suited, that our affections were misplaced. By then the events of last night will be old news, and your association with me will have lent you a certain untouchable quality. Beatrice Finch and her ilk will not dare trouble you again. You will be free to live your life as you choose your reputation, intact, perhaps even enhanced. It was a cold, calculated strategy. On the surface it was logical, even clever. He would use his formidable reputation to shield hers, and then they would walk away. But it felt like a devil's bargain, a path paved with hidden dangers. And what do you gain from this? Charade, she asked, suspicion colouring her tone. He gave a humourless smile. A reprieve. As I mentioned, I have obligations. There is immense pressure on me to secure a bride with a substantial dowry. A very specific bride, in fact. He didn't name her, but Elara could imagine a faceless heiress, chosen like a prize horse. If I am seen to be courting you deeply involved, it will keep the matchmakers and my family's creditors at bay. It buys me time to settle my affairs on my own terms. So she was to be his shield, as much as he was hers. A mutual, if deeply unconventional alliance. The artist in her was intrigued by the sheer drama of it. The woman was terrified. To spend weeks in this man's company to pretend an affection she did not feel, or worse, might begin to feel, was a perilous game. "You ask a great deal, Lord Blackwood," she said softly. "You ask me to place my entire future in your hands based on the word of a man I barely know." "I am aware of that," he said, his gaze softening, almost imperceptibly. "I am not a man who makes promises lightly, Miss Vance. I defended your art because I respect it. I will defend your honor with the same conviction. I give you my word. His word. The word of the Demon of Waterloo, a man renowned for his unbending will and ironclad integrity in the field. It was worth more than 1,000 flowery promises from any other lord of the ton." She looked down at her hands, at the faint dusting of charcoal still ingrained beside her nails. Her life was a precarious thing, a fragile vessel tossed on a stormy sea. His offer was a lifeline, but it was tied to a warship, powerful and dangerous. Could she risk it? What other choice did she have to refuse was to be cast back to the wolves. And my mother Elara asked, "She will expect a marriage. I will handle your mother," he said, with an assurance that was both terrifying and comforting. "We will tell her that we wish for a period of courtship to be certain of our attachment before making a formal announcement. It will satisfy her for now." Taking a deep breath, Elara met his gaze. The storm in his eyes seemed to have calmed, replaced by a watchful stillness. She saw the soldier in him, then the strategist planning a campaign. She was to be his most crucial piece on the board. "Very well, my lord," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I accept your proposal." A flicker of relief passed over his features, so quick she almost missed it. "Excellent. Then our courtship begins tomorrow. I will send my carriage for you at 2:00. We will take a drive through Hyde Park. It was the most public stage in all of London. There could be no clearer statement." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, her sketchbook still in his hand. "This," he said, holding it up. "May I have your permission to keep it for a while?" "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. A reminder, he said, his voice quiet, of what is real in a world of artifice. With that, he was gone. The next day, as promised, the gleaming black carriage of the Earl of Blackwood, emblazoned with a silver wolf's head crest, arrived precisely on time. Its appearance in their dreary street caused a sensation among the neighbours. Mrs. Vance was in a state of flustered ecstasy, convinced her every dream was about to be realised. Elara, dressed in her best day dress, and a bonnet that did little to hide the nervous flush on her cheeks, felt as if she was stepping onto a stage. Alistair was waiting inside the carriage. He was as impeccably dressed as before, but he seemed different in the daylight, more solid, more real. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. Their drive through Hyde Park was exactly the spectacle he had intended. Every head turned, fans fluttered, and conversations ceased as they passed. Elara could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes, but this time it was different. There was no scorn, no mockery. There was awe, curiosity, and a healthy dose of fear directed at her companion. Lady Beatrice was there in a high-perch phaeton, and the look of pure venom she shot in their direction was almost satisfying. Alistair was a surprisingly comfortable companion. He did not ply her with the meaningless compliments she was used to. Instead, he spoke of his lands in the north, of the challenges of crop rotation, and the new agricultural techniques he was trying to implement. He spoke with a passion and intelligence that she found captivating. In turn, he asked her about her home in Hampshire, about the woods and fields she so loved to draw. "You miss it?" he stated simply, after she described a particular stream she used to sketch. "Terribly," she admitted. "London feels like a cage. I know the feeling," he said, his gaze distant. After the war, everything here seemed so loud, yet so meaningless. It was a small glimpse into the man behind the title, a crack in the formidable armor. For the first time, Elara felt a genuine connection to him, a shared sense of being an outsider in a world that did not understand them. Their bargain, however, was never far from her mind. As they drove, they passed a carriage carrying a young woman with fiery red hair and a vapidly pretty face, surrounded by an entourage that screamed, "New money!" The girl's father, a portly man with a florid complexion, beamed at everyone, a clear sign of a man desperate to buy his way into society. Alistair's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He gave the carriage a stiff, formal nod. "Sir Reginald Grover and his daughter Miss Eleanor Grover," he said, his voice flat. Elara didn't need to ask. She knew with a sinking certainty that she was looking at the heiress, the woman he was supposed to be marrying, the woman her performance was designed to hold at bay. The sight of her was a cold splash of reality. This was all a game, a beautifully orchestrated deception. And as Alistair turned back to her, forcing a small smile, Elara felt a sudden sharp pang in her chest. It was a dangerous, treacherous feeling, one she knew she had to suppress at all costs. Because playing the part of the woman the Earl of Blackwood was courting was one thing. Foolishly starting to wish it were real was another thing entirely. And it was a path that could only lead to ruin. The weeks that followed were a surreal dream. Elara's life transformed so completely, it was almost unrecognizable. The Blackwood carriage became a regular sight in her modest street. Bouquets of flowers she knew he did not choose, they were too perfect. Too conventional arrived daily. Invitations that were once unthinkable now flooded their small parlor. They were courted, feted, and whispered about in every corner of the city. Mrs. Vance was in heaven, chattering endlessly about wedding plans, as if the proposal were a mere formality. For Elara, it was a period of exquisite tension. The courtship was a masterclass in public theatre directed by the Earl. In public, he was the model of a devoted suitor. He would place her shawl around her shoulders with a possessive air, his hand lingering just long enough to be noticed. He would lean in to whisper something in her ear during a concert, his proximity sending a jolt through her that was anything but feigned. He played his part perfectly, and Elara, a keen observer of human nature, found herself to be a surprisingly adept actress. But it was in their private moments, stolen between the public appearances, that the lines of their bargain began to blur. He would dismiss the footman and drive the carriage himself, sometimes taking them to places other than the fashionable haunts. He took her to a dusty bookshop on the Strand, where they spent an hour arguing happily over the merits of Lord Byron's poetry. He took her to see the Elgin Marbles, where he stood in silence before the magnificent horse-heads, a look of profound, weary understanding on his face. "They've seen battle," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "They've seen empires rise and fall. It puts a London season in perspective, doesn't it?" In these moments, she saw Alistair not Blackwood. She saw the man who preferred the quiet truth of stone and soil to the glittering lies of the ballroom. And he in turn seemed to seek out the truth in her. He would ask about her, drawing about her techniques with a genuine, intelligent curiosity. "Show me," he commanded one afternoon, as they sat in the relative privacy of a secluded park bench. Hesitantly, she took a new sketchbook from her reticule and a piece of charcoal. "What should I draw him?" he said, nodding towards an old man sleeping on another bench, his face a roadmap of a long and difficult life. As her fingers moved across the page, a familiar calm settled over her. She worked quickly, her focus absolute, capturing the sag of the man's jaw, the deep-set weariness of his closed eyes. She was so absorbed she didn't notice Alistair watching her, his gaze not on the page, but on her face, on the way her brow furrowed in concentration, and her lips parted slightly. When she was finished, she held it out to him. He took it and studied it, a long, appreciative silence stretching between them. "You have a merciless eye, Miss Vance," he said at last, though his tone was one of admiration. "You strip away all pretense. Is that a bad thing, my lord?" "It is a terrifying thing," he answered, his grey eyes meeting hers. "And I find I do not mind it at all." That evening, a thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. She wanted to draw him. Not the brooding Earl from a distance, but Alistair. She wanted to capture the man who argued about poetry and understood the sorrow in ancient statues. It was a dangerous, intimate impulse, and she knew she should resist it. Meanwhile, their performance was having its desired effect. Lady Beatrice Finch, consumed by a furious, impotent jealousy, was a constant, malevolent presence at the edge of their social engagements. Her smiles were brittle, her comments laced with acid, but Alistair's protective presence was an impenetrable shield. Ilara, once the object of her scorn, was now the source of her frustration, a position that brought a small secret thrill. But Beatrice was not one to accept defeat. If she could not attack Ilara directly, she would find another way. Her uncle, Mr. Finch, was not just a society gentleman. He was a shrewd man of business who managed affairs for several aristocratic families. And Ilara had noticed him in quiet, intense conversation with Lord Blackwood on more than one occasion. One afternoon, while attending a watercolour exhibition on Bond Street with Alistair, the trap was sprung. Lady Beatrice approached them, her uncle in tow. "Lord Blackwood, Miss Vance." Beatrice said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "How lovely to see you appreciating true art. Uncle, you remember the Earl?" "Of course, Mr. Finch," said a man with cold, calculating eyes. He bowed stiffly. "My lord, I was just reviewing the quarterly accounts for the Blackwood estate. Things are challenging." The comment was deliberately public. Alistair's posture became rigid. "Finch, this is neither the time nor the place." "Oh, but I think it is," Beatrice interjected, her eyes glittering with malice as she looked at Ilara. "You see, Miss Vance, being an Earl is a very expensive business, especially when one's father had a fondness for gambling and bad investments. An estate requires a significant influx of capital to be restored. A very significant influx." The meaning was crystal clear. She was telling Ilara in no uncertain terms that Alistair was bankrupt and that his courtship of a penniless artist was an act of financial suicide. "My finances are my own concern," Lady Beatrice Alistair said, his voice dangerously low. "Are they?" Beatrice smiled. "Or are they the concern of your future wife? A man in your position needs a partner who can help him. A partner with, shall we say, a dowry of at least £50,000. She glanced meaningfully across the room, where Miss Eleanor Grover was standing, looking utterly bewildered by a Turner painting. "A man in your position cannot afford to be sentimental." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She knew, of course, that this was the foundation of their bargain. But to have it laid bare so cruelly, to have her own lack of worth thrown in her face, was a fresh humiliation. She was the sentimental distraction, the penniless folly. Alistair took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You will be silent." he commanded Beatrice, his voice shaking with a contained rage. Why does the truth offend you? She shot back. Or does it offend your little drawing master's apprentice? She should know what she is walking into. She should know you are merely toying with her before you do your duty and marry the fortune your family so desperately needs. The scene was causing a stir. People were turning to stare, to whisper. It was the ballroom all over again, but this time the attack was not on her art, but on the very foundation of her relationship with Alistair. And this time, the accusation held the devastating sting of truth. Elara looked at Alistair, searching his face, and for the first time, she saw not a protector, but a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own. The weight of his duty, his obligations, was etched onto his features, a mask of grim resolve. And in that moment, she knew her foolish heart had already betrayed her. She had crossed the line from playing a part to living it. The pain of Beatrice's words was not just shame, it was the sharp, bitter agony of jealousy. Beatrice's venomous words hung in the air of the gallery, poisoning the atmosphere. The whispers of the onlookers were like the rustle of dry leaves, gossiping about the impending financial ruin of the Blackwood earldom and the foolishness of its current lord. Alistair stood like a statue, carved from granite, his rage a palpable force. But Elara knew his anger was not just for Beatrice. It was for the trap of his own life, a trap that had just been publicly sprung. "Come, Miss Vance," he said, his voice tight and controlled. He took her arm, his grip like iron, and steered her out of the gallery, leaving Beatrice with a look of smug triumph. The carriage ride was silent and fraught with a tension so thick Elara could barely breathe. The game was over. The pleasant illusion of their courtship had been shattered, and the cold, hard facts of their bargain lay exposed between them. He was destined for an heiress. She was the temporary diversion. When they arrived back at her lodgings, he did not leave immediately. He followed her into the small parlour, closing the door behind him. He paced the worn rug like a caged wolf, his hands clasped behind his back. She was right, he said, finally not looking at her. Every word she said was true. My father left the estate on the brink of collapse. The lands are mortgaged. The tenants are struggling. The only thing of value I have left is my name, and I am expected to sell it to the highest bidder. To Miss Grover, you do not have to explain yourself to me. My Lord Elara said, her voice hollow. It was the premise of our arrangement. Was it? He shot back, finally turning to face her, his grey eyes blazing. Was it just an arrangement when we spoke of Byron? When I watched you draw, has all of this felt like a charade to you, Elara? He had used her given name. It was the first time, and it struck her with the force of a physical blow. A wave of despair and a reckless, desperate honesty washed over her. No, she whispered the single word, a confession. It has not. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping just before her. He looked down at her, his expression a war of conflicting emotions, duty anger, and something else, something softer and far more terrifying. Nor for me, he admitted, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged murmur. This started as a strategy, a way to buy time, but it has become something else. Being with you, seeing the world through your eyes. It's the only time I have felt like myself since I returned from France. Not the Earl, not the soldier. Just Alistair. The name hung in the air between them, an offering and a plea. And in that moment, Elara's resolve, her carefully constructed walls of self-preservation, crumbled into dust. Then I will draw you, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Not the Earl. Alistair. Let me see him. He stared at her, surprised. A slow nod was his only answer. The next day he came to her, not in his carriage, but on foot, dressed in simple riding clothes, looking more like a country squire than a peer of the realm. For 3 consecutive afternoons, he sat for her in their cramped parlour. She worked not with charcoal, but with her precious watercolours, determined to capture the complex shades of the man before her. It was an act of profound intimacy. She studied every line of his face, the way the light caught the silver in his scar, the deep-set weariness in his eyes that warred with a fierce, burning intelligence. They spoke little, but the silence was filled with a deep, unspoken communication. She was not just painting his likeness, she was learning his soul. She saw the weight of his ancestors on his shoulders, the ghosts of fallen comrades in his gaze, and the deep, abiding frustration of a man of action forced into a state of gilded impotence. On the 3rd day, as she applied the final brush strokes, she knew she had captured it. It was the best work she had ever done. It was not a flattering portrait. It was a true one. All his pain, all his strength, all his conflict was there on the paper. "It is finished," she said softly. He came and stood behind her, looking down at the portrait. He was silent for a long time. That he said at last, his voice thick with emotion, "is how I feel." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his thumb gently stroking the fabric of her dress. "You see me, Elara, in a way no one else ever has." He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face. The air crackled. The world outside, with its debts and heiresses and scandals, ceased to exist. There was only the small parlour, the scent of paint and paper, and the storm in his eyes. He lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the public defiant act in the ballroom. This was private and desperate and real. It was a kiss full of longing and a deep, aching tenderness. It was a confession of everything they could not say, a lament for what they could not have. Elara melted into him, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt, returning the kiss with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated truth. But truth they were about to discover came with a price. Their moment was shattered by a frantic knocking at the door. Her mother burst in her face, pale with panic. "My Lord Elara, a letter has arrived. From your solicitor, Lord Blackwood. It is marked urgent." She held out a trembling hand with the sealed document. Alistair released Elara, his expression hardening back into the familiar mask of the Earl. He broke the seal and read the letter, his face growing grimmer with each line. "What is it?" Elara asked, her heart pounding. "It's Finch," he said, his voice like ice. "On behalf of Sir Reginald Grover. They are calling in my father's largest debt. The note is due at the end of the month. If I cannot pay, they will foreclose on the estate." Elara's blood ran cold. "But why now? It's not just Finch. It's Beatrice," he snarled, crumpling the letter in his fist. "She's forcing my hand. The letter contains an addendum, an offer from Sir Reginald. He will forgive the entire debt as a wedding gift upon my marriage to his daughter." It was a perfectly executed checkmate. Beatrice had not just exposed their ruse, she had used it to set a final, inescapable trap. Alistair was being given a choice: marry Miss Grover and save his family's legacy, his home, and the livelihoods of his tenants, or refuse and lose everything. And in either choice, he would lose Elara. He looked from the crumpled letter to her, his face a mask of agony. The duty he had been born to, the responsibility he carried for hundreds of souls, was a chain around his neck, pulling him away from her. The glory of his title had become the instrument of his torment. "Alistair," she whispered, her heart breaking for him, for them. "They've left me no choice," he said, the words torn from him. "I must meet with them. I must." do my duty." He looked at the portrait, at the truth she had captured on paper, and then at her, the woman who had seen that truth. A look of profound despair crossed his face before he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Elara alone with the beautiful, heartbreaking painting of the man she loved and the devastating silence of their impossible situation. Elara entered Lady Jersey's ball, wearing the pale blue gown of her public humiliation, a quiet act of defiance. Across the glittering room, she saw him, Alistair, a handsome prisoner, standing beside Lady Beatrice and the heiress he was meant to marry, their eyes locked in a silent, agonizing exchange. Just as despair threatened to consume her, Alistair's valet appeared at her side, presenting her with her watercolor portrait of the Earl. A note was attached, bearing a single powerful command in his handwriting: "Let them see the truth." As she revealed the painting, the famed artist Sir Thomas Lawrence, who had been observing her, pushed through the crowd. "My dear girl," he boomed his voice, silencing the orchestra. "This is not the work of a hobbyist. This is genius. You have captured the man, not merely the title." The crowd, once her tormentors, now stared in awe. Seeing his moment, Alistair strode across the floor, leaving a stunned Beatrice in his wake. He stopped before Elara, his voice ringing with conviction for all to hear. "I have just informed Sir Reginald Grover that his offer of marriage is irrevocably declined. I will sell what I must to clear my family's debts. It will mean a life of hardship." Then his gaze softened as he looked only at her. "But I would rather face that hardship with you than an eternity of wealth without you. Elara Vance, will you be my wife?" Tears of joy were her answer. "Yes," she whispered. "Always yes." He took her hand, and the cruel laughter of the ballroom was forgotten forever. Her glory was not a title gifted by an earl, but a truth they had forged together, a masterpiece of their own making. And so Elara Vance's story comes to a close, or rather, a new, more magnificent one begins. She did not find her glory in the reflection of an earl's title, but in the strength of her own talent, a talent that a good man had the wisdom to see. Theirs would not be a life of idle luxury, but one of shared purpose, rebuilding an estate with the same integrity and truth that defined their love. Her shame, born from the cruel laughter of a shallow world, was transformed into a testament to her resilience. The Earl's kiss was the spark, but her own courage and artistry were the enduring flame. They proved that true nobility isn't about the name you inherit, but the choices you make, and that the greatest love stories are not written in ballrooms, but forged in the crucible of truth and sacrifice. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. If you were moved by Elara and Alistair's story, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with a fellow romance lover, and subscribing to our channel for more tales of love against the odds. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a story.